everybody. We're going to get started now. I had a little bit of an issue with storage, but that's nothing for you to worry about. Welcome to Whitelock Fever Kick Live. My name's Steve Mascord, and we are discussing the NRL game tonight. First up, Melbourne 24, Sydney Roosters 6. And the big news, aside from that result, which would shock a lot of people, is that Luke Keary has gone to hospital with what could be a spleen injury. He played on injured for quite a part of the first half. He then received medical attention at half-time and couldn't continue. And he has now been taken to hospital. There's plenty of hospitals nearby in that part of Sydney. As my guest would be well aware, because he spent plenty of time in Sydney. Welcome to the show. Journalist John Davidson. How are you, John?
I'm very well, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Did you watch the match?
I saw some of it. I was on the phone for a bit of it, but saw bits and pieces, and very, very impressive from Melbourne without Cam Munster and Cam Smith, two cans.
Yes, and with these injuries now, and Boyd Cordner are likely to be rested for some time. It really puts a dent in the Roosters' title defence, doesn't it? I mean, there's some other sides looking pretty good at the moment. Obviously, Melbourne, Penrith looking pretty good. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not ready to write the Roosters off just yet. I mean, they can probably get Sonny Bill Williams to play back row, 5'8", hooker, wherever. He can do it all. But no, in all seriousness, they have got some real injury worries that they had before going into this game and really compound. I think Mitch Orbison looked like, I didn't see what it was, but he looked to be clutching his arm or his shoulder or something like that. So, yeah, it's going to really hurt them, you'd think, going into the finals, because there's obviously no reserve grade. So it's not like you can pick through young players to come in because they haven't been playing, so they're not necessarily match ready.
Now, the reason we got you on, and yes, there wasn't. I'm not going to pretend there was another person who was going to come on the program earlier, and I did, as a sort of person who works with me on rugbyleaguehub.com long reads, I did make you reserve guest. But I'm really glad you're here because what's happening at the moment in this country is quite incredible. Over the last few days, the last couple of days, we've seen the whole club have 6 players test positive for coronavirus, and they are not going to play this weekend, nor are their opponents from last week. Salford, there's been a bit of a fixture swap, so that there are still 4 matches this weekend. John, can you update the viewers and listeners on the latest on this story?
From what I was told yesterday, obviously 8 positive tests at Hull FC. Salford hadn't had any positive tests, which was good. But obviously, in Super League, everyone's only tested once a week on a Monday, so they're not tested 24 hours, 48 hours before a game. And I know, speaking to people at Salford, that their players were obviously mingling, in close contact with Wakefield and Wigan players and staff at the same venue after they played Hull. So obviously we think there'd be a possibility of transmission. I guess it's a bit of a waiting game now. Hopefully Salford do remain negative, but you would think they would have to isolate for some time to ensure that. And then, that it's going to be, maybe 2 weeks that they don't play a game, and then at least a week you would think for training, because they can't just go straight from not training from 2 weeks into playing a game. So, yes, it's definitely a massive shock, massive kick in the balls for Super League, which is obviously dealing with the Toronto issue as well at the same time. A real worry, I guess, for the broadcaster Sky, who puts in a lot of money into the sport.
In your view, what does this mean for the Challenge Cup weekend next week? Are those games going to have to be postponed as well?
I can't remember exactly who was playing who. You might have the fixtures to hand. I think Hull were obviously supposed to be playing, but yeah, I think they will be postponed. I don't see how you could be playing them Obviously they need to try and stop any potential infection getting passed on. You can postpone fixtures and replay them. But yeah, it's a bit of a wake up call, I think, because as you know, there's not really been any strict bubble in terms of players and staff enforced. And I know on social media, there's been plenty of talk and probably evidence of players out in restaurants and pubs, etc. Some probably have been flouting the general social distancing rules, but I don't think they've got a separate set of rules which prohibits them further than general members of the public.
Do those rules now have to be introduced, or is it just unrealistic, John?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough one. I think maybe they do. I think obviously in the NRL it's quite strict with the rules that people can and can't do it outside the bubble, and we've seen fines and sanctions. And speaking to the head of Salford yesterday in Bleed, he was sort of suggesting that they need to look at fines and sanctions for players and staff who do break the rules. I'm not suggesting anyone has it at whole, but obviously I know I've seen on social media before last weekend, there was people during the height of lockdown out, training with people from other households and then putting it all over Instagram, which is obviously A, not good, and B, not very smart to be sharing it with the wider world. So I think it's definitely something that the Super League will be looking at. I think they're meeting today about that because they need to get the season finished. They need to honour their Sky deal because as I understand it, there's no sort of clause that says they'll continue to keep getting paid even though there is a global pandemic going on. There's no force majeure clause, as they put it.
Yeah. So do you think that they will try to introduce a sort of strict NRL style bubble, or will they just basically say you've got to abide by the country's rules, or you shouldn't go out unless you've got to, or what do you think the most likely scenario is?
I don't think they'll introduce an NRL-style bubble because I don't think they'll be able to enforce it. They might not be able to get all the clubs on board, but I think they'll probably be stressing, or the clubs will be stressing, that they need to, that players and staff need to be more vigilant than they have been. I mean, the whole sort of funny, well, it's not funny, but unusual, I think, thing about it is, we've seen in New Zealand and in Australia probably a lot stricter measures when it comes to coronavirus, while they've had so few cases and so few deaths, while in the UK, which was or perhaps still is the worst in Europe in terms of deaths and cases, but the measures here are almost non-existent. So it's a real parallel between how people, I guess, serious people are taking it, and whether they, obviously, the inference is that they should be taking it a lot more seriously.
Yeah. And what do you think this period's done to the game? Do you think there's any danger that Sky, won't pay and that it could send the game broke? And also, and we'll move on to Toronto in a minute, but also the £16 million loan that the RFL secured from the government. What's that being, spent on? And can Super League come back from this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to scaremonger, but it's definitely very bad, and could derail the rest of the season. And obviously, the Super League clubs are going to have to pay a rebate already for games that they've not played to Sky for next year. So if we lose more games, then yeah, it's a massive issue. And if you're Sky, I think with Toronto pulling out, left already a hole in their broadcasting schedule. And then more games, and particularly because the ratings, I believe, the first couple of weeks have been really good, better than usual. You'd have to be very pissed off if you're Sky. And with the deal up at the end of next year and negotiating for a new one, you would be within your rights to kind of go, what are you guys doing at Super League, at the RFL? You need to get your house in order. In terms of what was your other point, the government loan. There's not really been a lot of transparency. Obviously, clubs, I know clubs in the Championship and League One have applied, and I think in Super League as well. Whether they've, how much they've received has not been, there's not been a lot of detail about that. But one thing I would say just on the testing, As I said, Super League clubs are only testing once a week. There's talk about at least doing a pre-game test twice a week. But the clubs are putting that bill themselves. So I think, that 16 mil alone, you would think some money could be spent on testing, or at least maybe, paying for one test a week for those clubs and players, because you think that would, I would think that would be a smart use of that money.
Yeah, it certainly speaks to the entire structure of the sport in this country and how cash-strapped it is, that the Super League clubs are, doing what they can to satisfy government regulations while spending the minimum amount of money. And the lower division clubs were better off not playing. Their businesses actually run better when they're not actually playing matches. So I don't know. You talk about sort of a catalyst for change. You never know whether this could be a catalyst for change in the British game. John, you've been obviously. Well, not obviously, people who are watching may not be aware, but been covering the Toronto situation for longer than anybody else. Who is this? Who's this? Is it one or two remaining consortia who are still interested in buying the license? Who are they?
To be honest, Steve, I don't know. You probably know more than me. I know obviously the Newcastle group has pulled out, and the New York group has pulled out. There's been other people involved who I think who have made offers who have been knocked back or have been left idle, so they've pulled out. Publicly, I think the club said there was 4 bids last week. So if you 4 minus 2 of Newcastle, New York, will be 2 left. I've heard whispers of a Toronto-based bid, and I think John Wilkins said some things on BBC, but it does seem to be very sort of possible, or it's all sort of in the air. There doesn't seem to be anything concrete that I've heard, which doesn't mean that there isn't. I think the issue for me would be, why would you buy a business that's going to lose millions of dollars every year unless you are going to get a cut of the Sky money? I don't see how anyone could think that was a sound business move. That's just me. And the indication is that they're not going to get a share of the Sky money. So it would be a very odd business decision, but that's not to say that someone wouldn't come in and buy them. And that's obviously at the moment the best scenario, and hopefully that does happen, and all the staff and players, etc., get paid what they owe, because it's a bit of a nightmare scenario at the moment. Another sort of PR disaster.
If the club is dead, what does that mean for Ottawa? Does that damage their likelihood of them being in League One next year?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question at the moment. I mean, I've been talking to Eric Perez yesterday. I mean, obviously they're sort of full steam ahead with their signings and what they're doing. But yeah, you have to think now that the appetite for expansion from the other clubs, which was probably healthy maybe 12 months ago or more, would obviously be a lot lower. They'd be warier. And the other issue is the coronavirus. They're supposed to be playing games in Canada next year. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen what the case or the death limit is in Canada, but you would think, hypothetically, there'd be some League One clubs now who will be like, well, we don't want to expose our players and staff to further risk by travelling to Canada next year. So do they have to play then? Ottawa do have to play all their games in England? How much would that cost them financially? Yeah, I think there's a lot of doubts now that have been raised, not only by COVID, but also what's happened in Toronto. And from what I understand with New York, they won't be playing any games next year because obviously the situation in New York's pretty bad in the US with COVID, and they won't be playing any games themselves. They may, or I think they're still hoping to host NRL teams, but playing against each other. But at this stage, you'd have to think that's pretty unlikely anyway.
Yeah. So, how much information, just as someone who's on the beat covering Super League and the lower divisions, how hard is it to get information out of clubs? And are there press releases every day? Is there someone? How accessible are the CEOs? Is there someone you can ring for a comment each day? What's it? Can you paint a picture for the viewers and listeners as to what it's like to cover the British game?
It's a good question. It's very hard and frustrating at times because some clubs are really helpful. Some CEOs, officials are quite good, and others, you can't lock down or won't respond or won't, really engage with the media at all. So you've got a real mishmash, of different styles and approaches. And obviously with the RFL and Super League, they're probably not the most engaged with the media at times or compared to some other organisations. So, yeah, it can be really quite difficult at times to try and get a full picture from everywhere.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about the venture we've got at Patreon with Rugby League Hub.com long reads. Why do you think people are signing up for that? The numbers continue to climb. There's a bit of a churn at the end of the month when people forget they've committed to pay their $5 and it comes off their card or their PayPal and they cancel, but they're usually replaced by one or two other people. What is it? What is it about sort of that sort of service that you think attracts people?
Yeah, we could probably do a show on journalism and the industry and what's happened to it, but I think there's obviously a lot of change out there in journalism in general, but in sports journalism, and we've lost a lot of publications, magazines. So I guess this tries to fill a bit of that void. And I think there's been a bit of a race to the bottom with some sort of media outlets and, the journalism, the churn of stories, the regurgitation. And I guess what we're trying to do is offer something a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more thoughtful. That's not necessarily out there on the market, I guess. So we're trying to fill a bit of a gap. And, with people like yourself and Ross Heppenstall and Maria, people who've been working in the industry for a long time, who are respected and credible. I think it's just trying to give a platform to good writers to display their craft. And obviously there's not a lot of money in journalism in terms of paying journalists or writers anymore. So it's great to have people support us because obviously the more subscribers we get, the more time and effort we can spend on, covering the big stories and trying to not only in-depth investigations, but also, opinion and features and stuff that other people aren't getting out there. Because I think, particularly in the UK market, perhaps compared with the Australian market, there is a real dearth now. When you've got writers like Dave Hadfield and etc., probably haven't been replaced from the pool of journalists that once was, previously in England.
Yeah, and mate, I was going to ask you one other thing about the mainstream press in this country that you work for. You work for the Eye. Can you tell us who you work for and how the desks, respond to rugby league stories and rugby league story ideas, and whether you've noticed any change in that since you've been working for those outlets?
I write for anyone who pays me, Steve. So you can call me a prostitute for words. As a freelancer, you got to pay the bill. So I started doing some stuff for the Eye. It's just all on a freelance basis, but around the 2017 World Cup. So I guess that was travelling to Australia and New Zealand to cover England, but cover the tournament. There wasn't many journalists coming over from the UK to actually cover the England team in the flesh. So that was sort of to offer to the end. I did that for the Guardian as well. I've been writing for different sports for the Guardian in Australia and occasionally the UK for 7-8 years. Just managed to build a relationship from there. And the Eye is a little bit different. It's not necessarily always hard news, but they like a bit more analysis, a bit more opinion, a bit more featurey stuff. There's not a lot of mainstream media coverage of rugby league in England, apart from probably the Daily Mirror every day, and the BBC, what he does on radio and online, and obviously Sky. So yeah, it's good, I think, to try and get some stuff in nationals, which lately, obviously, there's been a lot of news, not necessarily all of it good, but there has been a lot of news and a lot of coverage. But yeah, it goes back to something that I'm going to write soon, which is, and I think you've explored this in a piece on long reads on Patreon recently about a lot of people in England cry about they want mainstream coverage, they want more coverage, they want to be on a spectacle like football, but then when a story comes along and they get a lot of scrutiny and or coverage and or criticism, they moan about it. So it's kind of, there's an immaturity there in being trying to be treated like a big sport.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yeah, well,
if you want to be guaranteed positive coverage, take out an ad. Otherwise, you submit yourself to scrutiny in order to get free publicity, and the publicity is not always good. That's the price of getting the spot in the paper. That's the price.
Well, that's it. You've got to take the good with the bad. I'll use a quick example. I think it was last year at the season launch, or the year before anyway. Castleford had I think it was Lanzarote, their pre-season trip, and a few players had gotten a fight with each other, and this was on the back page of the Daily Star, which is one of the smaller national papers. But it was on the back page, which you don't get rugby league on the back page, unlike you do in the Daily Telegraph in Sydney or the Courier Mail. And Brian Carney made a joke, question and a joke about it to Daryl Powell at the season launch, and Daryl Powell almost jumped off his chair and gave him an uppercut. And obviously there was a lot of complaining about the fact that this story had made the back page, but that's what you get. You know what I mean? That this is the amount of bad stories and negative stories of football in England in the Premier League gets, is insane. So I think a lot of people in the English game, whether they be fans, players, coaches, administrators, don't understand what goes with having a big profile and what doesn't. And there's a lot of things that go on, and I'm talking misbehaviour, corruption, just general dodginess that gets swept under the carpet or ignored because not enough people care about rugby league. While in the NRL, we see it, on a daily basis exposed on Channel 9, on Fox, on in newspapers, on radio, etc. ad nauseum.
Things only improve when in the light of day. In the darkness, all the dodgy stuff goes. It continues. It's allowed to continue. Anyway, before we go, John, is there anything you'd like to plug? I know I've already helped you with one of those things, but anything you'd like to plug? You've got your own podcast.
You can follow By the Balls. I think we should have a new episode coming up soon. Alan Kilshaw, the former Rochdale Hornets coach, former Mackay Cutters assistant coach. I think he's going to be on talking about lots of stuff that's happening in rugby league at the moment. And 6 to Go, another podcast with Paul Bennett, the editor of League Weekly magazine, newspaper, which is obviously on hiatus. It sort of analyses the Super League games every round and touches on the NRL as well. And obviously rugbyleaguehub.com long read, sign up, £1 a week or $2 Australian a week. I think you'll enjoy what we have to offer.
And to support this podcast, it's patreon.com/White Line Fever. Thanks for your time, John. You're a great reserve. Sonny Bill's got a bit to beat next week if he comes up.